Will Smith just walked into the courtroom, uninvited. No subpoena, no lawyers, just truth. What he said next left the entire room in shockingly Diddy. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Will's steps echoed like a drumbeat across the polished floor. Not just footsteps, but an announcement, one that carried the weight of decades, the kind of steps that made people pause. That stopped even the courtroom clerks mid-motion, that made journalists lift their pens and blink, confused, unsure if what they were witnessing was real. Cameras clicked in confusion, a rustle of lenses shifting, zooming, trying to confirm if it was really him, not a look-alike, not a body double. Will Smith, walking into a federal courtroom without a lawyer, without an escort, without a whisper of warning. The prosecutor, mid-sentence, stammered. The judge paused, squinting behind her glasses. Diddy turned, slowly. The confident composure he wore like designer armor cracked just slightly. You had to know him to see it, but the shift was there. His jaw tightened, his hand clenched. Will walked straight to the witness stand. He didn't glance at the press bench. He didn't look at Diddy. He didn't nod to familiar faces in the gallery. His focus was razor-sharp, aimed only at the front of the courtroom. He didn't wait to be called, didn't seek permission to speak. He claimed his place. The bailiff, caught off guard, stepped forward instinctively, but stopped when the judge raised a hand. The room held its breath. Will reached the stand, placed his hand on the railing like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Then, in a voice low but unwavering, he said, "Your Honor, I'm not here under subpoena. I wasn't asked to be here." He took a breath, not to build drama, but to steady himself. "I chose to come." You could feel the ripple that ran through the courtroom, like a quiet gasp. No words, just tension shifting. It was a statement that meant something more than its surface. It meant, I'm done hiding. It meant, the silence ends here. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Smith, are you requesting to testify?" Will nodded, double quotes. "Yes, ma'am. I have something to say. Something that needs to be heard." She studied him. This was highly unorthodox. High-profile witnesses don't show up without legal teams and pre-approval. But this was no ordinary moment. And Will Smith was no ordinary witness, you understand. The judge said carefully that anything you say will be entered into the record and may be subject to cross-examination. "I understand," he said simply. Another pause. The courtroom teetered between order and eruption. "Then you may proceed," she said, signaling the bailiff to swear him in. Will placed his hand on the Bible, eyes steady. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." He sat down, but it didn't feel like he took a seat. It felt like he took a stand. And then, silence. Not the awkward kind, not the courtroom's usual procedural hush. This was heavier. Weren't sure they wanted to hear, like the air itself had thickened. Will scanned the courtroom once. Slowly, purposefully, his eyes didn't accuse. They didn't plead. They just carried weight, the kind that only comes from years of knowing. Things you can't unknow. When he finally spoke again, his voice was soft, but it cut like a blade. "I've been part of this industry for over 30 years. I've seen the surface, the red carpets, the smiles, the press tours, but underneath that, there's something else." He didn't raise his voice, slammed the table. He didn't need to. The truth didn't come loud. It came heavy. "I've stayed quiet for a long time. I told myself I was protecting people, that it wasn't my business, that I wasn't involved." He looked down at his hand, steady, yet marked by invisible burdens. "But silence is participation, and I won't carry that anymore." A single camera shutter clicked, then stopped. Even the journalist strained to stay writing. They were listening. Will Smith wasn't acting. This wasn't a performance. This was confession, revelation, and perhaps redemption, and the court knew the world was finally about to hear what he had kept buried for far too long. "Been in this industry for 3 decades, Will began, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I've seen things, the red carpets, the private jets, the exclusive premieres. I've smiled for the cameras. I've played the game, but nothing prepared me for that night." A hush swept across the courtroom. Even the clicking of pens had stopped. The only sound was Will's voice and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. "It was an invitation-only event," he continued. "One of those that doesn't show up in tabloids. no flyers, no photos, just a name. A time, a whisper passed from one celebrity to another. The kind of event where saying no feels like closing a door that you may never open again. Will paused, eyes distant. It was held at a mansion. Not just any mansion, this place sat atop a hill like it was watching over the entire city. Secluded, guarded, more security than the Oscars. He glanced up. When I arrived, my phone was taken. No excuses, no negotiation. Just a smile and a hand outstretched. For privacy, they said, but it didn't feel like privacy. It felt like control, like I was surrendering something more than a device. He rubbed his hands together unconsciously, as if still trying to shake off the sensation. Inside, the air was cool. Too cool. The architecture was beautiful glass walls, high ceilings, art worth more than most homes. But something was off. The mirrors were everywhere lined. The halls leaned in corners, embedded in ceilings. At first I thought it was just rich eccentricity. But soon I realized they weren't there for vanity. He leaned in slightly. They were watching us. The words landed like a punch. The music was soft, like it was designed to lull you. The lighting was low, warm, but disorienting. No clear shadows, no clear direction. People were already gathered when I arrived. Famous faces, some I'd acted with, some I'd admired, and yet they looked different. Their smiles didn't touch their eyes. Their laughs were delayed, forced. There was a tension in the air like everyone was waiting for something, but no one dared ask what. Will's gaze drifted to the back of the courtroom, as if reliving it in real time. Then he appeared. Diddy, even saying the name made the room lean in. He walked up to me like we were old friends. Big grin, arm around my shoulder. But his eyes, they didn't smile. He looked at me like I was an investment, like I was being assessed. Will took a breath. "Welcome to the real circle," he told me. He shook his head slowly. At the time, I thought he meant something symbolic, that I'd made it. That I was finally inside the elite inner world of Hollywood. I was wrong. The courtroom was frozen. No movement, no coughs, just silent tension. He led me down a staircase. It was hidden behind a bookshelf, like something out of a movie. But this wasn't fiction. I followed him because I was curious, because part of me wanted to understand what the whispers were about. His jaw tightened. We entered a room no guest should have entered. He stopped, choosing his next words carefully. There were people, lying on couches, slumped in corners, some barely conscious, others just watching, dazed. There was laughter, but not the kind you hear at parties. This was laughter with teeth in it, cold, unnatural. And then I saw the cameras. He gestured slowly with his hand, like tracing the memory. They were hidden in flower vases, inside air vents, behind those mirrors. And I realized this wasn't a party. It was a trap, a web. Will's voice cracked just slightly enough to betray the emotional cost. I saw familiar faces, people you'd know, people you'd never suspect. Some didn't even know they were being recorded. Some didn't care. His voice softened. I froze. He looked down. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I didn't do anything. I just stood there, watching. He lifted his eyes, filled with something deeper than regret. But even silence, in a place like that, is participation. And with that, the courtroom fell into a stunned, suffocating quiet. This wasn't just a testimony, it was a reckoning. A week later, the parcel arrived. No fanfare, no courier signature, just a small, unmarked box slid into the morning mail pile at the gate of his Calabasas estate. His assistant had placed it on his desk, alongside scripts and contracts. Will barely noticed it until he saw there was no return address, just a flash drive, and a handwritten note. "Welcome to the family." He held the note for a long moment. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant, but there was something menacing in its simplicity. No name, no threat, just an open-armed invitation that felt like a chain. At first, I didn't want to look, Will said on the stand, his hands clenched before him. Some instinct told me it was better not to know, but the other part of Mitha needed to be sure plugged it in anyway. The courtroom was silent, rapt. The air seemed to grow heavier with every word. The footage started in silence, Will continued, just grainy black and white video. At first, I didn't recognize the room. It looked like an old surveillance reel. Then the music kicked. In that low, eerie hum I remembered from the party. His voice dipped lower. It was that room. He looked directly at the jury, and I was in it. The jurors stiffened, as if they too could see the screen playing behind his eyes. There? I was standing in the doorway, looking confused, hesitating, but what they'd done, what they added, was worse. Will swallowed. They edited it, smoothed out the audio, removed certain sounds, spliced together moments from different angles. They turned hesitation into agreement, turned confusion into interest. They cut away everything that showed discomfort and kept just enough to imply something else. He shook his head in disbelief. With the right soundtrack, the right pauses, it looked like I was participating. Will took a slow breath before continuing. That's when I understood the game. He glanced down at the table before him, gathering himself. It wasn't about partying. It wasn't about sex or pleasure. These events were factories. They were producing leverage. Insurance policies, compliance. Will's voice darkened. Control. Then he told the courtroom about the phone call. It came 2 hours after he opened the flash drive. Unknown number. I should have ignored it, but I picked up and I heard his voice. He didn't need to say the name. The courtroom already knew. Now, you get it, Diddy said. Just like that. Casual.com. Like we were old friends, sharing an inside joke. Will mimicked the voice not in mockery, but in eerie accuracy. You're part of the circle now. Let's build something together. He looked out over the courtroom, scanning the faces, some horrified, some confused, others hiding, their recognition behind rigid professionalism. It wasn't a request, it was a statement. He was letting me know that I belonged to them now, that I had crossed a line even if I hadn't meant to, even if I hadn't participated. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. Just being there was enough. A rustle moved through the courtroom like wind through leaves. Spectators exchanged glances. Some reporters furiously scribbled. Others just stared. I realized then, Will said, that this is how they build the circle. You don't join, you get caught. Filmed, edited, leveraged, and once you're inside, you can't leave. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the judge. They don't need loyalty. They don't want friendship. They want obedience, insurance, and fear. He turned his gaze toward the prosecution bench, then the defense. Imagine knowing that at any moment a piece of footage can surface, edited just enough to ruin you. Not enough to prove a lie, but enough to plant a doubt. In your fans, in your colleagues, in your family. His voice cracked just briefly. That's the power they wield. The judge nodded solemnly. Defense attorney, who had been posturing confidently earlier, now looked rattled. Will concluded this part of his testimony with chilling clarity. I used to think power in Hollywood came from awards, box office numbers, or connections. But real power, the kind that makes you untouchable, it comes from secrets, from what people are too afraid to say. And the people in that circle, they collect secrets like trophies. And with that, Will sat back in his chair. No one clapped, no one coughed. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. From that moment, Will said, voice steady but low, every no I gave was punished. He didn't need to raise his tone. The weight of his words did the lifting. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it felt like typical industry turbulence. Delays, budget cuts, reshoots, but slowly, things started slipping. The courtroom leaned in, collectively holding their breath. A movie I was attached to, a passion project I'd been nurturing for years, suddenly got shelved. No warning, no explanation. A week later, the studio greenlit a different film with nearly the same plot. Starring someone else, Will looked down briefly, as if reliving the sting. My agent said it was just Hollywood stuff. But then another deal fell through. Then another. Directors stopped returning calls. Friends became distant. He paused. At first, I blamed myself. Thought maybe I'd lost my edge. Maybe it was just a dry season. That happens. He looked directly at the jury again. Wasn't a season. This was a system. Will clenched his jaw, and I wasn't the only one. The room went cold. I started having quiet conversations. Backstage at events, at late-night parties, not in the loud rooms. Those are filled with handlers and cameras. I talked to people in kitchens, in parking lots, in back hallways. tapped the witness stand softly, rhythmically. We were all getting the same offers, the same invitations, the same special opportunities, always off the record, always followed by the same phrase, "This is how things really work now." He shook his head, and when we said no, things started disappearing. The judge was still the defense, silent. One actor he won't name him here because he still fears for his life was once a rising star. A-list franchises, critical praise. He told me behind a stage curtain at an award show that he had tried to walk away. Will's voice darkened. 3 weeks later, he was everywhere. Or at least, a version of him was. Tabloids printed a 10-year-old story that had already been debunked. A gossip podcast suddenly had anonymous insiders talking about how difficult he was on set. Paparazzi caught him outside his home, looking unshaven and tired. Headlines called it a meltdown. Studio execs pulled out of deals overnight. Will's fingers tapped the wood again faster now. Within a month, he was radioactive. No one would touch him. The same people who once called him the future of cinema were calling him uninsurable. Will looked out over the courtroom with quiet intensity. He wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. He leaned forward. This wasn't bad luck. It was punishment, a warning shot to the rest of us. He took a breath one night. A producer I'd worked with, someone who knew I was starting to ask questions, called me in a panic. Told me I was being talked about in certain rooms, that I needed to lay low, play ball. Appear grateful. Well, let that sit. I asked him what he meant. He just said, "You're too loud, and they don't like loud." A low murmur moved through the gallery. The judge rapped his gavel once for silence, but his expression betrayed unease. So I tried to disappear. I started saying no more politely. I declined invites with excuses. I stopped taking certain calls, but that's when the machinery really kicked in. Will's voice took on a sharper edge. Stories started popping up, harmless at first. Will Smith losing his touch, aging icon, or burnt-out star. It wasn't criticism, it was character erosion. Just enough to make the world question me. He gestured, with a flat palm like erasing a chalkboard. That's how they do it. They don't destroy you overnight, they fade you out. One whisper, one headline, one ghosted call at a time. A pause. Will's eyes were full now, with tears but something more dangerous. Clarity, because once you're in that circle, the only way out is through fire. And they make sure you know it. Years passed. The cameras faded, headlines moved on. The spotlight found younger stars, and Willie became quieter. He buried it all deep. I told myself I was protecting my family, he said softly, eyes fixed somewhere distant, protecting my name, my kids, my legacy. He gave a sad smile, the kind only known by those who've lived with secrets too long. And maybe that was true. At first, but eventually it stopped being about protection. It became something else. Silence wrapped around the courtroom like fog. It became fear. He looked down, not of being hurt. I've faced that. I grew up around that. But of being erased, silenced, discredited, of having everything I built, everything I was turned into a weapon against me. He folded his hands, composed but trembling slightly. So I stayed quiet. I worked when I could, smiled when I had to. Played the game just enough to stay out of their crosshairs. His voice hardened. But I hated myself for it. Years ticked by, and then came the first lawsuit. Then another. The press rediscovered. The whispers they once buried. Survivors brave and battered stepped forward. Some with names, some anonymous. Their stories were messy, inconsistent at times. But raw and real. Will watched it unfold like a man standing on a pier. Watching a storm, he helped fuel by saying nothing. At first he said, I told myself, it wasn't my story. I wasn't the victim. I didn't get touched. I didn't get used. I just saw something, that's all. His voice caught, and he swallowed hard. But then he paused, collecting himself. Then one of them, someone who had spoken out with so much courage, stood in front of a camera and took it all back. Will shook his head slowly. They said it never happened. That they lied, that they made it up. He looked up now, locking eyes with the jury. But I knew that wasn't the truth, because I knew that face. I'd seen it in that basement. I remembered the tremble in their hands, the dead look in their eyes, He closed his own eyes as if reliving it. They broke that person, just like they tried to break me. A beat passed, then another. And that night, I didn't sleep. Will's voice dropped to a near whisper. I sat in my office alone. Lights off. Everyone in the house was asleep. I pulled up clips from my movies, from the old days. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. I watched myself deliver lines about justice, about truth, about standing up when no one else will. His jaw tightened, and I just kept thinking, who was that man? That guy up there on the screen? That wasn't me. He looked out over the courtroom again. That was a character, a costume, a projection. He leaned forward now, almost pleading, because when the moment came, my moment what did I do? I wore a nice suit. I shook the right hands. I stayed out of sight. Will took a long breath, and I asked myself, what was I, if not a coward? In a nice suit, the air in the courtroom was still, heavy, like before a thunderclap. All those years, I'd convinced myself I was surviving, that silence was strength, that being quiet was wise. But that night, sitting there, watching a broken soul take back their truth just to save their skin, he looked haunted. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer, because silence in this world isn't neutrality, it's permission, it's complicity. The judge shifted uncomfortably. A juror wiped at their eye. Even the defense team seemed to shrink slightly in their chairs. That's why I'm here, Will said, more firmly now. Not because I was subpoenaed, not because I want revenge, but because somewhere out there, someone else is staying silent. Tonight, he straightened in his seat, steadier now, and I want them to know they're not alone. Will stood taller in the witness box now. A quiet strength rippled through his voice, no longer cracked with guilt, but sharpened by resolve. This wasn't just Hollywood, he said clearly, his eyes scanning the jury. This wasn't just about a few bad parties or celebrities misbehaving. This was deeper, bigger. He gestured subtly, not just at the defendant's table, but beyond it, beyond the courtroom, beyond the cameras. This was media, brands, lawyers, private intelligence firms. This was systems, well-funded, well-connected, well-insulated systems. A whisper moved through the crowd. The defense attorney scribbled something, but Will wasn't looking anymore. We were told it was a club, a circle, but it was more like a machine, one designed for control. You could be the face of a billion-dollar film, the darling of the press, the hero in every living room, if and only if you played along. He paused, let that hang in the air. If not, Will's jaw clenched. If not, your name was dirt. A photo flashed in his mind, tabloid headlines, clickbait videos, fake scandals, and carefully leaked whispers meant to confuse the public and discredit anyone who resisted. I've lived both lives, he said. I've seen what happens when you play along, and I've felt what happens when you stop. He turned slowly, eyes now fixed on the man seated at the defense table. Diddy. Will didn't flinch. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Didn't just exploit people. You engineered silence. Gasps erupted in the back of the courtroom, but Will kept going. You weren't just a man throwing parties. You were a man building prisons, invisible ones, the kind that don't need Barzi's just secrets, just pressure. He took a breath. Every time someone walked into one of your so-called events, they gave up something. Sometimes their phones, sometimes their dignity, and sometimes their voice. Will's tone was steady, deliberate. You made sure of that. He explained how it worked. How the machine operated. First, there was the invite. Exclusive. Last minute. VIP only. That was the bait. It fed egos and made people feel chosen. Then the environment. Luxurious, indulgent, but off. Surveillance hidden in plain sight. Rooms people weren't supposed to enter. Rooms designed for leverage. And if someone slipped or hesitated, that's when the real machine kicked in. Will recounted whispers of entire firms paid not just to clean up Mesiza, but to manufacture them, NDAs, legal traps, hacked phones, altered footage, handpicked gossip writers with anonymous sources. Even charity galas used to launder reputations. You see a celebrity fade out of the spotlight overnight, and you think, maybe their time just passed, Will said, scanning the room. But sometimes they just said no. He sighed, and that was enough. The courtroom was frozen. Even the judge, usually so stoic, had her hands steepled in front of her mouth, returned to Diddy. I remember you once said, everyone's got a price or a pressure point. I laughed at the time. I thought it was just you being cocky, but you meant it. You had eyes everywhere, friends in networks, brand deals ready for those who behaved, and scandal files for those who didn't. He shook his head. You didn't just benefit from the silence. You cultivated it. You monetized it. Will leaned forward slightly. You turned secrets into currency, and people into collateral. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Will dropped his voice low, almost like a confession. I stayed silent because I thought I was protecting myself. But I realize now, every day I stayed silent, someone else suffered. Someone else got crushed by that machine. Someone weaker. Someone younger. Someone with no one to believe them. And all the while, the world kept cheering, kept buying, kept watching because they didn't know. He looked at the jury again. But you do now. Will turned to the jury slowly, his eyes lingering on each of them 12 ordinary people, now entrusted with the burden of an extraordinary truth, not weak and softened, as if he were no longer addressing the courtroom alone, but the countless others listening beyond these walls. I failed, he said plainly. I failed myself. I failed people who looked up to me. I failed people who didn't have the platform I had. He paused, breathing through the knot in his throat. I let fear win for too long. Silence settled like dust across the courtroom. You could almost hear hearts breaking, some in the jury box, some in the gallery, and many watching on screens outside. It started small, Will continued, his tone raw. A party I shouldn't have stayed at. A favor I shouldn't have. Accepted a secret I shouldn't have kept. But those small things, they snowballed. And every time I looked the other way, every time I convinced myself it wasn't my business, the lie grew. He looked down for a moment, collecting himself, and I got good at pretending. That's what actors do, right? We make it look easy. I smiled for the cameras, walked red carpets, got standing ovations. But inside, I was dying by inches. He raised his head again, now speaking directly to those trapped in the very silence he'd known for years. To anyone out there still stuck in this web, still afraid, still telling yourself that silence is safety. He paused, choosing every word with precision. I understand. Will's voice cracked again, this time not with weakness, but with shared pain. I know what it's like to wake up at 3 a.m. and wonder if your whole life is about to implode. I know what it's like to see a name trend online and wonder, am I next? I know the look in your eyes when you're pretending everything is fine. I see you because I was you. Then he took a breath, slow and steady, and straightened his spine. But here's the thing about the truth. When the truth is, buried, it doesn't die. It waits. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience. He let the silence breathe before continuing. It waits, and it grows teeth. Will's gaze hardened not with anger, grows in the dark. It festers in guilt and shame. And when it finally rises, when it finally bites back, it doesn't just punish the guilty, it consumes everything. Your peace, your integrity, your sleep, your soul. He looked again at the jury, and then beyond them, toward the cameras, toward the millions who might one day watch this footage in a classroom, a courtroom, or a dorm room late at night. I carried that lie for years, a lie that said if I stayed quiet, I could survive, that if I looked away, I could protect the people I love. But silence didn't protect me. He pounded the wood of the witness box, softly but deliberately. It caged me. A few gasps in the gallery. Someone wiped their eyes. The judge gave no rebuke. Everyone could feel the gravity in the room. And I know, Will continued, that right now, somewhere, someone is watching this sitting in a dressing room, or a private jet, or a penthouse suite, and telling themselves what I once did. Just stay quiet. Don't rock the boat. Play the game. It's not your fight. But it is. His voice rose, not shouting, but undeniable. Because every time we let another person get hurt, another life get ruined, another lie get printed, we're part of the machine. And that machine only stops when we stop feeding it. He leaned forward slightly. I don't know what happens after this. I don't know if my career ever recovers. I don't know who stops calling, or who unfollows, or who turns their back. But I do know this. I won't be part of this lie anymore. A long pause. Then the final words. Not for a role, not for a paycheck, not for comfort, not even for survival. He looked straight into the camera, now into the homes of those still hiding, still debating, still too afraid to speak. If you're scared, I understand. But you don't have to stay scared, because the truth, when you finally speak, it out loud isn't a weakness. It's a weapon. This story is still unfolding. The courtroom isn't the only battleground. Silence is part of the system, and breaking it, that's the first blow.